intent in this case is much stronger and much more pervasive than it was in both of those cases. We say that the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from this evidence is that there was an intent by Myanmar to destroy the Rohingya Muslims as a group in whole or in part. My review of the evidence this morning will necessarily be introductory. The speech is intended as an overview of our case. This afternoon and for the 3 days that follow, you will hear a comprehensive presentation of it and how it satisfies the standards set by the court for proving both the actus reus and the dolus specialis of genocide by Myanmar. My intention now is to provide a roadmap that assists you in fully appreciating our presentation and in understanding how each of our speeches, as it is delivered, builds to the inevitable conclusion that Myanmar is responsible for the commission of genocide against the Rohingya Muslim group. With these opening remarks, I turn to the Bosnia and Croatia cases. As we all know, the Bosnia case is the only one in which the court found that genocide was committed. The court found it at one specific location, Srebrenica. The evidence showed that Srebrenica was predominantly inhabited by Bosnian Muslims. After it was taken over by Bosnian Serb forces, those forces separated approximately 7,000 Muslim men from the general population, removed them to a secluded area, and murdered them. As the court explained, quoting from the ICTY's trial chamber in the Krstić case, the perpetrators, quote, systematically targeted Bosnian Muslim men of military age, regardless of whether they were civilians or soldiers. Women, children, and the elderly were spared from death. They were forcibly displaced to other parts of Bosnia. Citing the appeal chamber in the Krstić case, the court found that the killing of such a large number of men, 1/5 of the overall Srebrenica community, quote, would inevitably result in the physical disappearance of the Bosnian Muslim population of Srebrenica. The court concluded on the basis of these facts that the actus reus of genocide under Article 2A and B of the Convention had taken place. The court found, further, that upon capturing Srebrenica and segregating the male population, quote, the Bosnian Serbs devised and implemented a plan to execute as many as possible of the military-aged Bosnian Muslim men in the enclave, and that this was sufficient to satisfy the dolus specialis requirement. The existence of this plan, which was not spelled out in any document, was considered proven by a number of factors identified by the court, namely, the number and nature of the forces involved, the standardized coded language used by the units in communicating information about the killings, the scale of the executions, and the commonality of the killing methods applied. Mr. President, it is our submission that if the court were to apply the same legal and evidentiary standards to the present case, it would have to conclude, as others have done, that Myanmar committed acts of genocide with genocidal intent against the Rohingya Muslim population during its so-called clearance operations in 2016 and 2017. In this case, unlike Bosnia, there were numerous Srebrenicas, that is, massacres of large numbers of Rohingya Muslims to destroy the group, based on their identity as such, carried out by Myanmar's armed forces in multiple locations across northern Rakhine State, where the vast majority of the Rohingya Muslims lived. In other words, what was proven to have occurred at a single site in Bosnia is proven here to have occurred in scores of different Rohingya villages in Myanmar. Many examples are given in our written pleadings, some of which will be discussed in detail by my colleagues. For now, I will call your attention to three of these. The first is Mingi, a village in Mongdaw Township. You can see its location on the map on your screens. Mingi had a population of approximately 4,300 Rohingya and 400 ethnic Rakhine. The UN fact-finding mission found that Mingi was, quote, the location of one of the largest and most egregious mass killings. Myanmar's armed forces, known as the Tatmadaw, commenced their so-called clearance operation in Mingi in the early morning on 30 August 2017. As reported by the UN fact-finding mission, as soon as soldiers entered the village, they, quote, opened fire and began burning houses. They shot directly at crowds of people fleeing to the riverbank or trying to swim across the river. Many of them were killed. Others, especially children and the elderly, drowned while trying to escape. Hundreds of Rohingya who did not manage to get away were trapped and, quote, rounded up on the riverbank. The Tatmadaw then separated the men and systematically executed them with rounds of bullets and killed those who had survived the shooting with large knives. According to the fact-finding mission, the Tatmadaw next, quote, turned to the women and children. Some of the children, continuing to quote, were shot, some thrown into the river, and others thrown onto a fire. An eyewitness recalled seeing around 27 children's bodies floating in the water afterwards. Tatmadaw soldiers then took dozens of women and girls to nearby houses. The fact-finding mission reported, upon arrival, each group was taken to a different room. Once in the room, women and girls were stripped and beaten with sticks, punched or stabbed. They were then raped in groups of up to 7 victims at a time. Many of the women and girls had infants and children with them who were killed or severely injured while their mothers were raped. The houses were then often locked and set on fire, and most victims who were still alive were burned to death. Mr. President, this went far beyond the horrors inflicted during the Srebrenica massacre, where women, infants, children, and the elderly were not attacked. Satellite imagery analyzed by UNICEF confirms the determination by the fact-finding mission that the Rohingya houses and structures in Mingi were, quote, completely burned and destroyed. By contrast, the part of Mingi inhabited by ethnic Rakhine, a predominantly Buddhist ethnic group favored by Myanmar's military regime, quote, remains intact. Destruction of this Rohingya village and many others like it, after killing, grievously wounding, raping, and forcibly displacing the population, reflects even more than an intention to destroy the Rohingya as a population. It demonstrates an obsession with erasing them and their homes permanently from historical memory. The second example is Chatpin, a village in Rautadong Township, shown on your screen now. The clearance operation there took place on 27 August 2017. According to the UN fact-finding mission, quote, hundreds of Tatmadaw soldiers surrounded the village, opened fire, shooting at villagers, including those who were fleeing, dragged people from their houses, shot them at point-blank range, or slit their throats with large knives. An elderly woman described to the fact-finding mission what occurred after she and her 70-year-old brother were pulled from their house. Soldiers used rifle butts to beat my brother on the head, and I saw his brains come out. I saw people being killed with long knives. The soldiers were also spraying bullets, and many people were injured and killed. Our village was full of dead bodies. I saw dozens of people killed. First, they shot the people, and then, if they were still alive and the body was moving, they used a machete to slaughter across the throat. The fact-finding mission found that the Tatmadaw, quote, set houses on fire, including those still occupied. Rohingya victims were, quote, forced inside houses before they were intentionally set alight. The fact-finding mission determined that the Tatmadaw, quote, specifically targeted children, including infants and babies. Quote, some were wrenched from their mother's arms and thrown to the ground. Others were thrown into fire and burned alive. Children and babies. In the aftermath of the assault on Chatpin, witnesses saw, quote, dead bodies everywhere, including those of children floating in the river. No less than 127 children under the age of 6 were slaughtered in Chatpin. As at Mingi, the UN mission found that women and girls were subjected to, quote, rape, gang rape, sexual mutilation, and sexual humiliation, including the mutilation of their breasts. UNICEF satellite imagery confirms the fact-finding mission's conclusion that, quote, the entire Rohingya village of Chatpin was destroyed, while in contrast, the nearby non-Rohingya village, quote, remains intact. The third example is Mongnu, a village in Buthadong Township. It's shown on your screen now. On the same day as the massacre at Chatpin, villagers awoke to the sight of several trucks full of soldiers arriving, with other troops advancing in small groups on foot. They surrounded the village and, quote, whoever ran was shot at. As reported by the UN fact-finding mission, the soldiers approached a compound of 2 large and interconnected houses where approximately 200 Rohingya had sought shelter, and ordered the people to come out of the houses or else the buildings would be set on fire. Without waiting, they broke down a door in the main house and fired their weapons into it. Then they, quote, separated women and children from men and, quote, took the men out of the house and tied up their hands behind their backs. A soldier, identified by several witnesses as Sergeant Ba Kyo of the 564th Light Infantry Battalion, after speaking on the phone, told his detachment, quote, "We will kill them." The soldiers then, quote, opened fire on the men and boys and, quote, slit their throats with knives. Similar groups of men were taken to other places in Mongnu, where they were shot or hacked to death. Again, as at Mingji and Chatpin, the Tatmadaw took special aim at women and girls. Here, too, the UN mission found that many were, quote, gang raped, killed, and mutilated. Employing the same modus operandi as at the other two Rohingya villages just discussed, the Tatmadaw burned Mongnu to the ground in the days following the clearance operation. UNISAT analysis of satellite imagery confirms that around 320 structures were destroyed by fire in Mongnu and another nearby Rohingya village. These three villages are but a few examples. The evidence shows that Myanmar carried out clearance operations employing similar tactics and methods with the same extreme brutality and sexual violence and devastating effects in many other Rohingya villages in northern Rakhine State, with the gravest incidents having taken place, in addition to the three villages I have just discussed, in 4 other locations shown on this map. From north to south, they are Gudarpin, Indin, Khotan Kok, and Chain Kar Li. In total, the UN fact-finding mission reported that very similar mass atrocities against unarmed and defenseless Rohingya civilians were perpetrated by the Tatmadaw during these clearance operations in at least 54 separate locations. Clearance operations following the same modus operandi took place in numerous other Rohingya villages across northern Rakhine State. The mission verified through multiple interviews and other information clearance operations similar to those detailed above in a total of 54 separate locations, and it received first-hand accounts of additional clearance operations in a further 22 locations. The evidence shows that these were not random acts or the unintended consequences of undisciplined soldiers run amok. The timing and nature of the attacks make this clear. The Myanmar military units were not a group of Serb irregulars who suddenly formed an intention to destroy the Bosnian Muslims who had fallen into their hands after taking Srebrenica. Here, the evidence shows that the Tatmadaw units that deployed to scores of Rohingya villages in northern Rakhine State were following orders from a central military command which planned and directed that the clearance operations be carried out in all of these locations. As at Srebrenica, the genocidal intent of that plan is clearly identifiable from the particular circumstances of its execution. Unlike Srebrenica, Myanmar's plan was carefully and deliberately developed at the highest military level, not spontaneously by irregular forces on the scene. And it was executed across a large number of geographic locations, an even clearer reflection of Myanmar's genocidal intent. There is no doubt that Myanmar's soldiers were acting pursuant to orders emanating from the top of its military hierarchy. Myanmar does not dispute that the Tatmadaw operated under a highly centralized command structure removed from civilian oversight. At its apex was the commander-in-chief, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who directly commanded the Army, Navy, and Air Force. His authority also extended to all of Myanmar's security forces, including the border police, border guards, and civilian militias. According to the UN fact-finding mission, quote, the commander-in-chief led the Tatmadaw General Staff, which was responsible for formulating the objectives and limits of military operations, the role and composition of the forces involved, the rules of engagement, and the necessary logistics. In Myanmar's armed forces, as in the militaries of other states, subordinate officers and units operate pursuant to direct orders from their superiors, deviation from which risks immediate sanction. As Senior General Hlaing himself emphasized, quote, discipline and obedience are the backbone of the Tatmadaw, and each and every serviceman must strictly follow rules and regulations, orders and instructions. Beyond the Tatmadaw's command structure and organization, the existence of a calculated plan, conceived and developed at the highest level, to carry out the clearance operations against the Rohingya Muslims is evidenced by the strikingly similar modus operandi with which these operations were executed all across northern Rakhine State. In dozens of locations, the UN fact-finding mission observed a remarkable similarity in the timing of operations, the sequence of events, the types of weapons used, the assistance received from other security forces or ethnic Rakhine, the coordination and division of roles between perpetrators, the types of violations, and the manner in which they were committed. The modus operandi of these attacks was recognizable and consistent throughout. This could not have occurred. This could not have occurred in the absence of significant levels of forethought and organization. On the basis of this evidence, the fact-finding mission found that there was a, quote, consistent pattern of conduct, which is, quote, only possible when all troops are acting under the effective control of a single unified command, and that their operations have been, quote, planned, ordered, and supervised at the level of the commander-in-chief. This is another aspect of our case that makes it much stronger than the Bosnia case. In that case, the court did not find a pattern of conduct from which an intent to commit genocide against a specific group could be inferred. The particular circumstances of the massacre at Srebrenica, which the court did deem sufficient to constitute genocide, were not found to have occurred at other locations in Bosnia. This gives rise to a situation here that was not present in Bosnia, whether in addition to the particular circumstances of the massacres at numerous Rohingya villages, an intent to destroy the Rohingya as a group can also be reasonably inferred from what the fact-finding mission called Myanmar's, quote, consistent pattern of conduct in at least 54 different locations. In addressing this issue, as Professor Sands recalled for you, the fact-finding mission identified 7 factors drawn from the court's jurisprudence and that of other international tribunals, which it regarded as indicators of genocidal intent. And it considered whether these factors were present in Myanmar's clearance operations against the Rohingya. It then found, based on its comprehensive investigation and voluminous evidence, that every one of these 7 boxes could be checked. First, the Tatmadaws' extreme brutality during its attack on the Rohingya. It is beyond dispute that the Tatmadaw conducted the clearance operations with extreme brutality. They killed, maimed, and tortured members of the Rohingya group indiscriminately in a manner that inflicted maximum harm. The atrocities encompassed, among others, large-scale burning of victims alive, often by confining them in homes that were then set ablaze, mutilation with knives, soaking victims in petrol and setting them on fire, and the stabbing, cutting, or fatal beating of infants and young children in the presence of their parents. As regards boys and men, their Srebrenica-style separation and execution was a common feature. Second, the organized nature of the Tatmadaws' destruction. As already noted, the evidence establishes incontrovertibly that the clearance operations were carried out in a highly organized manner, pursuant to a coordinated military plan developed by the Tatmadaws' High Command and approved by the Commander-in-Chief. The clearance operations were thus preceded by careful pre-planning and preparation, and then executed according to plan by similar means across scores of Rohingya villages in northern Rakhine State. Third, the enormity and nature of the sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls during the clearance operation. The UN fact-finding mission identified as a, quote, notable pattern the perpetration of, quote, mass gang rape involving multiple perpetrators and multiple victims in the same incident. Victims included children and pregnant women, and the Tatmadaw committed these atrocities with unspeakable depravity, often subjecting the victims to torture and mutilation before killing them. Fourth, the insulting, derogatory, racist, and exclusionary utterance of Myanmar officials and others prior to, during, and after the clearance operations. Myanmar has steadily propagated over decades a racist message that the Rohingya are an impure and subhuman race that originated elsewhere, came to the country illegally, and reproduced so rapidly like animals that they threatened to supplant the pure-blooded national races favored by the government. Myanmar's dehumanizing anti-Rohingya hate speech reached a crescendo during the clearance operations in August and September 2017, when Senior General Hwang, the Commander-in-Chief, spoke of the threat to Myanmar's other races posed by the Rohingyas' mere existence, and gave his assurances that the Tatmadaw would soon be solving the long-standing, quote, Bengali problem, which was until then a, quote, unfinished job. Similar derogatory and threatening racist messages about the Rohingya were disseminated on Facebook, which had widespread reach in Myanmar. The UN's Independent International Mechanism for Myanmar, IIMM, which succeeded the fact-finding mission and supplemented its work, determined that at least 43 Facebook pages were connected to the military and used by the Tatmadaw at the time of the clearance operations, quote, to increase animosity toward the group. Imbued with these messages, Tatmadaw soldiers showed no restraint in their efforts to complete what their commander-in-chief told them was an unfinished job. As one Tatmadaw officer declared, quote, if they're Bengali, they'll be killed. Others, also taking the cue from the commander-in-chief, declared that the hour had come to, quote, kill all the Bengalis and destroy their race so that, quote, none of them should be left alive. Fifth, the existence of discriminatory laws and policies. For years prior to the clearance operations, Myanmar adopted and enforced racist laws and policies that specifically targeted the Rohingya, stigmatized and isolated them, characterized them as mortal enemies of the Buddhist peoples of Rakhine State, and incited violence against them. These official measures included deprivation of nationality and citizenship, restrictions on marriage and childbirth, prohibitions on movement and employment, and confinement in internment camps and ghettos. The UN fact-finding mission found that these openly racist laws and policies, quote, adversely impacted every aspect of their life, including their access to food, livelihood, health, and education. Sixth, the government's tolerance for public rhetoric of hatred and contempt for the Rohingya. Myanmar's senior military and civilian leaders not only tolerated, but actively disseminated vicious hate speech, turning the Rohingya into objects to be feared and despised by other ethnic and religious groups, and inciting those groups to rise up against them. The chief actor was Senior General Lang himself, who incited Myanmar's Buddhist races against the Rohingya by openly declaring that absolutely our country has no Rohingya race, and warning that, quote, the Bengali population had exploded to the point that it would, quote, swallow them up. And seventh, the state's failure to investigate and prosecute gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, both as they were occurring and after they occurred. Despite the enormity of the crimes committed, Myanmar has been unwilling to properly investigate, let alone prosecute the perpetrators. Instead, it has steadfastly refused to cooperate with impartial international agencies, including from the United Nations, and it has invested heavily in destroying evidence, including by razing the remains of the Rohingya villages where the genocide occurred. True to its nature as a de facto military government, Myanmar has cloaked its armed forces in an impenetrable gown of impunity. After reviewing the evidence of Myanmar's conduct under these 7 headings, the UN fact-finding mission concluded in 2019. Every one of these indicators is linked to the acts or omissions of Myanmar state organs, including the military, other security forces, ministries, legislative bodies, the UEHRD, and other civilian institutions. Collectively, they demonstrate a pattern of conduct that infers genocidal intent on the part of the state to destroy the Rohingya in whole or in part as a group. For reasons explained in its 2018 report, there is no reasonable conclusion to draw other than the inference of genocidal intent from the state's pattern of conduct. In sum, the evidence of genocide, including genocidal intent, is not only much stronger and much more pervasive in Myanmar than it was in Bosnia, but it was determined by the fact-finding mission to permit no reasonable conclusion other than genocide. Instead of a single Srebrenica, there were multiple villages where similar massacres of Rohingya Muslims took place. Instead of a renegade Serb militia whose action the court was unable to attribute to a state, in Myanmar it was the state itself through its armed forces which perpetrated these atrocities. Instead of an impromptu intent formed immediately prior to the genocidal acts, in Myanmar there was a plan prepared well in advance of the clearance operations at the highest level of the armed forces and dutifully executed by subordinate officers and enlisted personnel throughout northern Rakhine State, employing the very same modus operandi. In Myanmar, in contrast to Bosnia, genocide, including genocidal intent, is proven not only by particular circumstances in particular locations, but also by a pattern of conduct demonstrating the existence of a plan, the intent of which it can only reasonably be inferred from its nature and the manner of its execution was to destroy the Rohingya as a group. Mr. President, the evidence before you also distinguishes the present case from the Croatia case. In Croatia, the court found neither particular circumstances, nothing equivalent to the massacre at Srebrenica, for example, nor a pattern of conduct from which genocidal intent was the only reasonable inference to be drawn. The case is nevertheless helpful to us here for several reasons. First, the court found that the actions of the respondent state constituted a pattern of conduct, evidenced by what it called, quote, similarities in terms of the modus operandi used between some of the attacks confirmed to have taken place, end of quote. These similarities included attacking and occupying Croat localities and creating what the court called, quote, a climate of fear and coercion by committing a number of acts that constitute the actus reus of genocide within the meaning of Article 2A and B of the Convention. Finally, the occupation would end with the forced expulsion of the Croat population from these localities, end of quote. By the same reasoning, the evidence in our case plainly establishes a pattern of conduct by Myanmar across the expansive geographic area in which the majority of Rohingya lived in northern Rakhine State. As you have seen, this was the conclusion reached by the UN fact-finding mission. Second, to determine whether genocidal intent could be reasonably inferred from the respondent state's pattern of conduct, the court considered factors that largely overlap those employed by the UN fact-finding mission in our case, and which the mission concluded were indisputably present in our case. According to the court, The most important factors in revealing a genocidal intent were, as Professor Sands recalled earlier, 1, the scale and alleged systematic nature of the attacks. Check. 2, the attacks are said to have caused casualties and damage far in excess of what was justified by military necessity. Check. 3, the specific targeting of Croats, in this case, the targeting of Rohingya Muslims. Check. 4, the nature, extent, and degree of the injuries caused to the Croat population. Again, substitute Rohingya Muslim for Croat and check. The court did not find that all of these factors were present in Croatia, but they are all undeniably present in our case. Third, and this is the feature that most distinguishes Croatia from our case, the court found that Serbia's policy was to establish an ethnically homogeneous Serb state, following the forced displacement of Croats from the parts of Croatia that Serbia hoped to annex, or at least control. The court found it determinative that this intention, quote, namely the forced displacement of the Croats, did not entail their physical destruction. It was not a question of systematically destroying that population, but of forcing it to leave the areas controlled by these armed forces. In other words, for the court, Croatia v. Serbia was a case of ethnic cleansing, but not genocide. To be sure, the one does not necessarily exclude the other. In the Bosnia case, the court explained that, quote, acts of ethnic cleansing may occur in parallel to acts prohibited by Article 2 of the Convention and may be significant as indicative of a specific intent, dolus specialis, inspiring those acts. However, in the Croatia case, the court did not consider that Serbia's ethnic cleansing of Croats was indicative of an intent to destroy them as a group. Its findings were to the contrary. It concluded that, quote, Croatia has not established that the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from the pattern of conduct it relied on was the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Croat group. This further distinguishes the Croatia case from our case. Myanmar's pattern of conduct, in contrast to that of Serbia, does not permit the court to reasonably infer that its intent was to forcibly displace or ethnically cleanse the Rohingya Muslim group. Myanmar itself does not claim that this was its intent, or that such an intent can be reasonably inferred from its conduct. In fact, Myanmar has consistently denied this. To be sure, Myanmar's clearance operations caused massive forced displacement in addition to killing, maiming, and raping of the Rohingyas. As the court explained in Croatia, the existence of genocidal intent in such circumstances depends on whether, quote, the forced displacement was carried out in circumstances calculated to result in the total or partial destruction of the group. The evidence in our case shows plainly that it was, as the fact-finding mission concluded. As Professor Sands told you, Myanmar argues that the clearance operations were intended neither to forcibly displace, ethnically cleanse, or destroy the Rohingyas as a group. Its only defense of this conduct is to claim that its actions were intended to combat terrorism, specifically to counter the activities of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, referred to by the acronym ARSA throughout the pleadings. The clearance operations were exercised in counterterrorism against ARSA, says Myanmar, not efforts to destroy the Rohingya as a group. This is, frankly, a hopeless argument that is entirely unsupported by the evidence. But in the circumstances, it appears to be the best defense that Myanmar can gin up. And we will give it due attention over the course of our presentation this week, including with a speech on Wednesday devoted entirely to this issue. For now, as a sort of preview, I will simply make 3 points about it. First, it is fundamental and should not be debatable that actual counterterrorism is based on ensuring the safety and security of the affected population and gaining its loyalty and support. This cannot be reconciled with sending the armed forces to scores of villages, setting fire to homes with families still inside them, shooting at everyone who moves, rounding up men and boys for mass execution, hacking children and infants to death, raping, gang raping, and mutilating women and girls before killing them, forcing survivors to run for their lives, and then razing their villages to prevent them from returning. This is what the evidence shows Myanmar did, and it is a description of genocide, not counterterrorism. Second, this is not a case, as Myanmar has argued in its written pleadings, of applying Western standards to a less developed country in the global South. Yes, our expert witness, Professor Michael Newton of Vanderbilt Law School, from whom you will hear next week, is a retired U.S. military officer. But he has devoted both his military and academic careers to the law of war, and particularly to matters of counterterrorism, including in non-Western and developing states. His expert testimony is that the fundamental principles of counterterrorism strategy and tactics are nearly universally accepted, including most significantly by Myanmar itself. This is reflected in the Tatmadaws' own rules of engagement, which Myanmar has very helpfully attached to its pleadings. There is no problem with these rules, according to Professor Newton. The problem is, as you will be shown by my colleagues, that Tatmadaw completely ignored them in carrying out its clearance operations against the Rohingya. Most prominently, as the UN fact-finding mission concluded, the killing of civilians is inherently brutal in any context. The perpetrators of the clearance operations in Rakhine State introduced an additional dimension to this. There was not the least effort to make any distinction between ARSA fighters and civilians, or to specifically target a military objective or identify and repel an immediate threat. Everyone was a target, and no one was spared. Mothers, infants, pregnant women, the old and infirm, all fell victim to the ruthless campaign. The targeting of women and girls for rape, gang rape, and other forms of sexual violence, as well as the targeting of and impact on children in general, has been shocking. The brutality with which the underlying acts were carried out provides further support for a conclusion that they were committed with genocidal intent. My third point is that the clearance operations were by several orders of magnitude far out of proportion to what was needed to defend against ARSA. This is how the UN's independent investigative mission for Myanmar described ARSA's capacity in August 2017, when Myanmar launched its clearance operations. Based on photographs and videos released by the Myanmar military, publicly circulated footage, witness testimonies, and official statements, the mechanism found that by August 2017, ARSA likely possessed a modest arsenal of 40 to 70 firearms of mixed types and calibers. Most ARSA members primarily used bladed weapons, sticks, and a limited number of artisanal firearms. While IEDs appear to have been used in the 2016 and 2017 attacks, there is no conclusive evidence that firearms were employed. It is not surprising that Myanmar would attempt to transform ARSA, armed mainly with knives and sticks, into a major fighting force and national security threat. To be sure, we do not suggest that Myanmar should have ignored ARSA. As a sovereign state, it had the right to defend itself against such an outfit, even if it was as poorly equipped as the evidence shows. However, history teaches us that when genocide occurs, it is almost always under cover of armed conflict. In this regard, it would be wise to recall the words of Judge Cansado Trindade in the Croatia case, partially quoted by Professor Sands. One cannot characterize a situation as one of armed conflict so as to discard genocide. The two do not exclude each other. In this connection, it has been pertinently warned that perpetrators of genocide will almost always allege that they were in an armed conflict and that their actions were taken pursuant to an ongoing military conflict. Yet, genocide may be a means for achieving military objectives, just as readily as military conflict may be a means for instigating a genocidal plan. Before concluding my presentation, I'd like to call attention to one more distinguishing feature from the present case and both the Bosnia and Croatia cases. In the prior cases, the court had the benefit of findings of fact by another international judicial body, namely the ICTY. To be sure, the court did not rely on those findings exclusively. In Bosnia, the court found helpful a report by the Secretary General on the fall of Srebrenica, describing it as having considerable authority because of the care taken in its preparation and the independence of those responsible for it. Likewise, in Croatia, the court found that it must give evidential weight to a report by the UN Special Rapporteur by reason both of the independent status of its author and of the fact that it was prepared at the request of organs of the United Nations for purposes of the exercise of their functions. Here, the centerpiece of our case has been from the very beginning the two voluminous reports consisting of more than 600 pages prepared by the UN fact-finding mission appointed by the Human Rights Council, which were published in 2018 and 2019. These too are notable for the care taken in their preparation and the independence of those involved. The evidence contained therein has been supplemented in the course of these proceedings by numerous equally independent and authoritative reports from the IIMM, other United Nations bodies, impartial non-governmental organizations, and various states, as well as 48 sworn statements from eyewitnesses, all consistent with the conclusions of the fact-finding mission, and all supportive of the Gambia's submission that Myanmar acted with genocidal intent in carrying out its clearance operations against the Rohingya in 2016 and 2017. Mr. President, members of the court, I will speak again at the beginning of this afternoon session, delving further into the reliability of the sources of evidence on which the Gambia replies. And in the interest of time, I will simply conclude this presentation now by thanking you for your kind courtesy and patient attention, and asking that you call my good friend and esteemed colleague, Mr. Arsalan Suleiman, to the podium.
I thank Mr. Leichtler. I now give the floor to Mr. Arsalan Suleiman. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you again and to represent the Gambia in this significant case. This case is about Myanmar's acts of genocide against the Rohingya group. As I will explain, there can be no doubt that the Rohingya are a protected group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Myanmar's refusal to recognize them as such, or to even use the term Rohingya, is entirely without effect or relevance. I begin my presentation by providing an overview of the relevant geography, demography, and history of northern Rakhine State, the area where the Rohingya have mostly lived, or at least where they lived before Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations. I will then address the evidence that establishes the Rohingya to be an ethnical, religious, and/or racial group within the meaning of the Genocide Convention. On the screen is figure 1.1 from the Gambia's memorial. This is a map showing the location of Rakhine State outlined in red. This is the westernmost state of Myanmar with a coastline that runs along the Bay of Bengal. Zooming in, you can see more clearly that Sittwe, the capital of Rakhine State, is depicted on the map with a small circled black dot. Most of the acts of genocide during the so-called clearance operations that we focus on in this case occurred in the 3 townships northwest of Sittwe. Those townships, Buthidong, Mongdaw, and Rathidong, are depicted in figure 1.2 from the memorial, which you can see on your screens. Townships are an administrative unit of local governance in Myanmar. They are made up of towns and villages. The villages are grouped into village tracts. Numerous specific villages where clearance operations occurred are also depicted on this map. These townships are predominantly rural agrarian communities with populations spread out among hundreds of villages across these lands. The houses are mostly made of bamboo, with roofs made of palm leaves. There are no major urban population centers in this part of northern Rakhine State. The manner in which the Rohingya population was situated geographically in small villages rather than large urban centers is a key factor for the court's understanding of that part of the Rohingya group targeted by Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations. The total population of Rakhine State, as estimated by Myanmar's 2014 census, is 3.19 million. This includes people from many different ethnic groups, including Rakhine, Rohingya, Mro, Kaman, Dainet, Chin, and others. Around 1.1 million people out of that figure were, quote, unenumerated. This is because Myanmar reneged on its explicit commitment to allow the Rohingya to self-identify as such in that census. Those wishing to self-identify as Rohingya were not allowed to formally participate, but the 3.19 million figure includes that estimated unenumerated population. The population of Rohingya in all of Rakhine State, including in the state capital Sittwe, was estimated to be around 1.1 to 1.4 million pre-clearance operations. The largest Rohingya population centers were in the principal towns in Mongdo, Buthidong, and Rathidong townships. But in many of the villages, the populations were around a few hundred people. Over 700,000 Rohingya fled the clearance operations in 2017 and took refuge in Bangladesh. In terms of the Rohingya population, specifically in each of Buthidong, Mongdo, and Rathidong townships, those numbers are less certain. Before the clearance operations, the Rohingya made up around 80 to 90% of the population of these three townships, with Rakhine making up most of the rest of the population. According to data from Myanmar's 2014 census, Buthidong Township had a population of around 206,000 people, Mongdo some 112,000 people, and Rathidong around 140,000 people. It is unclear to what extent, if any at all, these figures include the unenumerated population. Mr. President, members of the court, for centuries, the Rohingya have called Rakhine State, or Arakan, their home. The Rohingya report, authored by Francis Wade for the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which we also refer to as the IIMM, notes that Muslims have been present in what is now Rakhine State since at least the 9th century, when Muslim seafarers set up trading posts along the coasts. There is additional compelling evidence that the Rohingya have lived in present-day Rakhine State for centuries and have called themselves Rohingya. A 1799 British colonial ethnography published by Dr. Francis Buchanan noted that, quote, the Mohammedans who have long settled in Arakan and who call themselves Rohingya, or natives of Arakan, end quote, speak their own dialect. An 1811 article in the British Classical Journal identified Rohingya as one of 3 languages spoken in the Burma Empire. The collection of languages published in 1815 by German professor J.S. Vader included an entry for Rohingya, noting the existence of the Rohingya ethnic group and its distinct language. Myanmar argues that there are no other similar historical sources that refer to the Rohingya as such. This fails to refute the fact that these specific sources did exactly that. At a minimum, these sources document the fact that the Rohingya referred to themselves as such going all the way back to the end of the 18th century. Myanmar also argues that most of this population immigrated to Myanmar during the British colonial period, which began in the mid-19th century. While it may be the case that some populations moved into this region over time, the historical record makes clear that the Rohingya had been present as a group in this region for 3 centuries. The historical record also shows that after Burma's independence in 1948, its political and military leaders recognized the Rohingya as a distinct ethnic group. The first Prime Minister, U Nu, made the following statement in a 1954 radio address. Quote, "The people living in Mongdo and Buthidong regions are our nationals, our brethren. They are called Rohingyas. They are one of the same par in status of nationality with Kachin, Kya, Karen, Mon, Rakhine, and Shan. They are one of the ethnic races of Burma." End quote. As noted in the IIMM Rohingya report, Prime Minister U Nu's administration had Rohingya government ministers and parliamentary secretaries. There was a Rohingya Students' Association in the University of Rangoon. And in 1961, there was a Rohingya language radio broadcast on the public radio station of the Burma Broadcasting Service. In the early years after Burma's independence, there was an armed insurgency of Rohingya who sought to separate northern Rakhine State from Burma and join what was then called East Pakistan, or present-day Bangladesh. The Burmese army quashed that insurrection, whose fighters were referred to as Mujahideen. In July 1961, during the so-called Mujahid insurgent surrender ceremony, Burma's Vice Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Brigadier General Aung Gyi, delivered a speech identifying the Rohingya as an ethnic group in Burma. His speech is at Annex 143 of the memorial. In relevant part, General Aung Gyi said the following, quote, "In central Burma, there are people who hold the view that people in this region are not Tai Yin Tha, or ethnic group native to the Union of Burma. These are false views. I want to openly and publicly tell you this. We consider the Rohingya people of Mayu district an ethnic minority integral to the Union of Burma. Let me be very precise about this. Those of you here ought to view yourselves as an ethnic minority of Burma. Only then will peace prevail in this region and in this country of ours." End quote. He went on to recognize the legitimate grievances of the Rohingya that had led to the insurgent movement in the first place, and declared that the persecution of the past was ending. Quote, "They said the Mujahideen rebellion broke out because of religious persecution. They said there was economic persecution. They said there was racial persecution. Yes, they are correct, as these rationales and explanations were true to a certain degree before. But that was the past. There is no more racial persecution, for we have emphatically and categorically recognized Rohingyas as an ethnic minority, making efforts for the progress and development of the Rohingya ethnic minority." End quote. Myanmar quotes from his speech in its rejoinder, using its own translation, to argue that General Aung Gyi referred to the Rohingya as the same ethnic group as existed across the border in present-day Bangladesh, and not as a distinct ethnic group in Myanmar. I will address the argument about the distinctiveness of the group shortly, but what is important is that Myanmar concedes that General Aung Gyi used the term Rohingya to refer to the Muslim majority population of present-day northern Rakhine State. Unfortunately, the commitment to recognition and inclusion and an end to persecution referred to in these speeches, the very same demands that the Rohingya have to this very day, did not hold true. Those who sought to exclude the Rohingya from the country soon regained power. In 1962, a military coup ousted the civilian government, and there began a long process of systematic persecution and discrimination against and exclusion of the Rohingya, extending and enlarging over the next several decades. This eventually culminated in the genocidal clearance operations of 2016 to 2018. Ms. Pasipanocha will go into further detail on the history of discrimination as one of the indicators of Myanmar's genocidal intent. I will now address why the Rohingya are plainly a protected group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Article 2 defines genocide as any of the acts listed therein that are, quote, committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. As articulated in Bosnia v. Serbia, the court has defined a group for purposes of the Genocide Convention as, quote, a collection of people who have a particular group identity, end quote, that is defined by, quote, positive characteristics, national, ethnical, racial, or religious, end quote, which can be identified through a, quote, combined subjective-objective approach, end quote. The key objective factors include distinguishing well-established or immutable characteristics, such as language, religion, citizenship, or hereditary physical characteristics. The key subjective factors include self-identification, perceived characteristics, and socio-historic context. Myanmar argues that these ethnical, racial, or religious characteristics must be such that the group is, quote, distinct from the rest of the world's population. There is no basis in the court's jurisprudence for this extreme position, which seems more motivated by Myanmar's desire to deny the existence of the Rohingya group than an effort to reasonably address the court's standard for defining the group under the convention. There is also no basis in the court's jurisprudence to apply, as Myanmar seeks to do, a high standard of proof applicable to findings of genocide to the identification of the group at issue. As the court made clear in Bosnia, all that is necessary is that the positive and objective characteristics of the group are such that it would enable the court to, quote, have in mind the identity of the group against which genocide may be considered to have been committed, end quote. The identity of the Rohingya group is clear. First, the Rohingya are rightly considered as an ethnical group given their language, culture, self-identification, and their identification as such by Myanmar and the United Nations. Clear evidence indicates that the Rohingya group speaks a common language, namely the Rohingya language. As noted, British and German ethnographic documentation from 1799, 1811, and 1815 refer to the Rohingya language as being spoken by Rohingya in Burma. Furthermore, a 2018 report from the NGO Translators Without Borders found that among Rohingya refugees surveyed, all, quote, said that they speak Rohingya, with 99% of them saying it is their primary language at home, end quote. That it is the, quote, only spoken language that all Rohingya refugees understand and prefer, end quote. Myanmar has not challenged this evidence. Rather, Myanmar argues that the Gambia has not established that the Rohingya speak a language not shared by others in the Chittagong division in Bangladesh. That is not something that the Gambia is required to prove. The fact that the Rohingya share this specific language is a positive characteristic that helps to establish their identity as an ethnical group. As the Gambia noted in the memorial, the Rohingya language is related to the Chittagonian dialect of Bangla and considered by anthropologist Dr. Pras Freeman to be a different dialect, one that the Rohingya view as central to their ethnic identity. Even Myanmar has noted the Rohingya's shared language in defining the group for purposes of its first report on implementation of the court's order on provisional measures. In that document, Myanmar noted that members of the group, quote, speak an Indo-European tongue, which is a variant of or is closely related to the Chittagonian dialect, end quote. The Rohingya also share a common culture. As discussed in the memorial, the Rohingya's shared culture includes communal organization around a mosque or group of mosques, an emphasis on family and community, and their own music, art, poetry, and foods. Myanmar again argues that these cultural characteristics may also be common to communities in Bangladesh, But that does not rebut the fact that these shared cultural characteristics allow for the identification of the Rohingya as an ethnical group in Myanmar. The subjective factor of self-identification is also highly relevant to the characterization of the Rohingya as an ethnical group. As noted, ethnographical reports from the 18th and 19th centuries document their historic self-identification as Rohingya. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported that Rohingya Muslims self-identify as a distinct ethnic group with their own language and culture, and claim a long-standing connection to Rakhine State. Other authoritative UN reports, like the reports of the UN Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, have found that the Rohingya self-identify as such. As noted in the memorial, 85% of the Rohingya self-identified as such during Myanmar's 2013 Inquiry Commission on Sectarian Violence. And as noted earlier in my presentation, an estimated 1.1 million people were recorded as unenumerated in Myanmar's 2014 census because Myanmar did not allow them to self-identify as Rohingya in that census. Furthermore, Myanmar itself clearly recognized the Rohingya as an ethnic group in its early years after independence. The speeches of Prime Minister U Nu in 1954 and General Aung Gyi in 1961 clearly acknowledged and accepted the Rohingya identity as such. Moreover, Myanmar's long-standing discriminatory treatment of the Rohingya, which will be discussed in further detail by Ms. Pasipanochka, also confirms their distinct existence as a particular group in Myanmar. Finally, the international identification of the Rohingya as a distinct ethnic group by the United Nations and other states is a relevant subjective factor. In addition to the reporting by the UN entities noted above, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has identified the Rohingya as a group since 1978. UN bodies like the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council have consistently referred to the Rohingya group by that name in dozens of UN resolutions, specifically addressing concerns over the treatment of the Rohingya, as have the UN Special Rapporteurs on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. And as noted in the Gambia's reply, the courts of several states, including Japan, France, and Australia, have all found persecution against the Rohingya based on their identity as such. All of these objective and subjective factors indicate that the Rohingya are widely recognized as an ethnical group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Second, the Rohingya are also a distinct group of Muslims for purposes of the Genocide Convention. It is not disputed that the Rohingya are predominantly Muslim. In fact, Myanmar consistently refers to the Rohingya by their religious identity as Muslims as a means of identifying them as a group. For example, as the court may recall, Myanmar's first agent in this case, the former state councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, referred to the Rohingya as, quote, Muslims living in Rakhine State during the oral proceedings on provisional measures. And in the first report on implementation of the court's order on provisional measures, Myanmar referred to the group as one of two, quote, sizable Muslim communities, end quote, in Rakhine State, the other being Muslims of the Kaman ethnicity. The historical record also confirms the close association of the Rohingya with Islam. Myanmar notes in its rejoinder that the British colonial census data refers to Arakan Mohammedans, that is, Muslims of Arakan, the territory that is now Rakhine State, which is one way in which the term Rohingya itself could be defined. The Muslim faith identity of the Rohingya group is central to their otherization and dehumanization in Myanmar, key parts of the genocidal process to which they have been and are being subjected. Several discriminatory laws, like restrictions on marriage and on the number of children couples could have, were explicitly targeted against Muslims, as you will hear in the presentation later today by Ms. Pasipanochia. And the pervasive hate speech that targeted the Rohingya often focused on the threat that they, as Muslims, allegedly posed to Myanmar's Buddhist majority population. You will also hear more on that later today. Myanmar argues that if there are non-Muslim Rohingya, then it cannot be considered as a religious group under the convention. But religion is not an immutable characteristic. So individuals who identify ethnically as Rohingya could be non-Muslim. They can convert to another religion or no longer believe in any religion. Many consider the small Hindu population in northern Rakhine State to be part of the Rohingya ethnic group. Indeed, in its counter-memorial, Myanmar states, "Not all Bengalis in northern Rakhine State are Muslim. A small minority are Hindu or Christian." Nonetheless, when the Gambia is referring to the Rohingya group, it is referring to that group based in part on its primary identity as a group of Muslims. Myanmar further argues that the Rohingya cannot be a separate religious group because they are not distinct religiously from the many Muslims in neighboring Bangladesh. But the existence of Muslims in Bangladesh is not relevant to defining a group in Myanmar for purposes of the convention. As we know from the court's decision in Bosnia, a geographical limitation combined with a religious identity can be used to define a group for purposes of the convention. For all these reasons, the Rohingya are a religious group within the meaning of Article 2 of the convention. Finally, the Rohingya are also a racial group under the convention. A racial group can be defined by objective characteristics like physical traits, as well as subjective factors like their socio-historic context and their perception by Myanmar authorities. Myanmar is a deeply race-based country. Citizenship is defined by belonging to 8 so-called national races. Myanmar's 135 officially recognized ethnic groups all fall within one of these 8 races. Despite the early recognition of the Rohingya as an ethnic group by Burma's political and military leaders, the Rohingya have since been excluded from these national races. Thus, Myanmar considers them to be a different race from these national races, which is effectively an admission that they are a distinct racial group. In describing the Rohingya, Myanmar officials have been documented as referring to their darker skin color and their being of, quote, Bengali stock. Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya, which includes severe restrictions on movement and lack of access to health care, education, and livelihoods, is implemented by recognition of members of the group based on their physical appearance. The reality of this race-based treatment of the Rohingya, combined with their long history of persecution, constitutes a subjective factor allowing for their treatment as a racial group in Myanmar for purposes of the convention. Myanmar once again argues that these factors do not establish the Rohingya as a race separate from people of Bengali origin, but that is not what matters. So long as the objective and subjective characteristics allow the court to identify the group at issue in Myanmar, the Rohingya can be considered as a racial group for purposes of the convention. In conclusion, Mr. President, the relevant objective and subjective factors establish without the shadow of a doubt that the Rohingya of Myanmar are an ethnical, racial, and/or racial group for purposes of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Thank you, Mr. President, members of the court, for your kind attention. Mr. Reichler will give the Gambia's next presentation, but this concludes the Gambia's presentations for the morning session. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Suleiman. This concludes this morning's sitting. The oral proceeding will resume this afternoon at 3 p.m. The sitting is closed.